Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the escalation of World War I. That's right. We are all up in it right now, right? We are literally in the trenches, holding the Maxim guns, getting after it, and seeing the growth of a large-scale industrial war like the world had never seen before, right? And we left off in class talking about a lot of really good stuff. And we got a lot of really great questions last class, right? Like we started talking about stalemates, right? And how this war in trench warfare is going to lead to a large-scale stalemate, right? Where no one was actually winning because you're actually fighting from these in-ground trenches, right? And just trying to get like small yards at a time, right? And so what ends up happening is basically the Central Powers and the Allies end up in a deadlock with one another where they just can't seem to win, and they just keep throwing super aggressive tactics at one another. Some of those include this thing known as going over the top, which is going to be a very, very old, outdated, and a stupid military strategy idea by a lot of these generals, both Allied and Central Power generals, that are going to come up with a bright idea being like, you know what we should do to break the stalemate? Why don't we just send the men into no man's land and get them to run over into the enemy trench and just see if they can kill as many of them as they can, right? Which is ridiculous and never actually worked, right? And the other thing that we also saw as well is the growth of early weaponry, right? Now, just to give you a little heads up, we are going to be getting after it in this flip and really crash course in a lot of stuff, and we're going to do this entire thing and the Russian Revolution in less than 22 minutes, right? I'm keeping this bad boy under 22 minutes. I got you, all right? Let's get after it, though, okay? So when World War I broke out, you also saw the large-scale escalation of weaponry, and technology will begin to take over as we move from our earliest weapons from 1914 to 1916 being things like rifles, machine guns, the Maxim gun, and barbed wire, which becomes a very, very all-important defensive structure with the trenches themselves because it literally prevented people from getting into the trenches and also even led some generals to trying to spend millions of shells from artillery guns, these bad boys right here, these massive cannons where they literally lobbed big bullets over top of no man's land into the other side's trench, and they literally would spend millions of those artillery shells trying to get rid of, right? But these rifles, machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire were just the earliest phases of weaponry that was actually used during World War I. Later weapons will begin to take hold as technologically and the Second Industrial Revolution begins to inject itself into a modern war, right? You're going to see the growth of landmines. You're going to see the growth of poisonous gas and gas masks, which included not only mustard gas to any of the shout out dads or moms listening to this in the background being like, oh yes, I know what mustard gas is. It's not just mustard gas, it's also chlorine gas and even phosgene gas as well, right? Was used to try and break the stalemates in World War I. Zeppelins were used for bombing runs. By 1915, you're going to see the use of airplanes in the military, specifically biplanes at the time. After this guy named Anton Fokker came around and invented this thing called the Fokker Scourge, which is going to be a device that I know it sounds inappropriate, but that's the guy's name. Anton Fokker, right? Now it's literally this German guy who realized a way to make it so you could mount machine guns on either side of your actual like plane itself and use the propeller to fire the machine gun so the bullets could go through the propeller without actually hitting it, right? Tanks are then going to be debuted as well as by 1916, but the thing about it is that there's outdated strategy at play here as well. So a lot of these generals were really garbage, right? So for example, there's a guy that I hate so much that you don't need to write down, but his name is Douglas Haig, right? Douglas Haig was a general that was an old cavalry general from the 1800s, and he believed truly that horsemen, cavalry-mounted horsemen, would run through the enemy trench one day and break the lines and then roll the trenches up to either side. Well, the thing about it, though, is you got guys like that are leading this war, right? Who are just sending anything they can at the enemy line, hoping that it would break the stalemate. But the thing about it is that as these weapons begin to develop and as you see the growth of tanks and airplanes and zeppelins and poisonous gas and all this different stuff used during this war, it actually led to mass casualties and low morale, right? You've got men that don't want to fight this war anymore because they don't want to get poison gas attacked, and you're going to see large-scale death rates at a lot of these battles because they just couldn't simply win this war. At the Battle of the Somme, for example, where you actually see that number right there, 300,000 men died in less than a few hours, right? So the thing about it is how do you win then? So what do? Kelsey Doyle asked a great question in class the other day when she said, so how do you win? How do you win a stalemated war like this? Well, we began talking about this in class a little bit, Kelsey, right? How do you win a war that looks like this, where you're dug literally into the dirt and you're using some of the worst man-made technology that the world's ever seen on one another, on your fellow man and human being? Well, the thing about it is, y'all, is that World War I, by this this point, by about 1915, had already turned into what is known as a war of attrition, right? A war of attrition is when the sustained process of wearing down your opponent so as to force a physical collapse, right? So basically, they're going to continue to fight each other until one other side doesn't have the ability to fight anymore, right? And so, for example, the British and the Allies are going to adopt a very bold strategy to try and push that attrition along, right? And what they do is they blockade Germany, right? So Germany has a very, very, very small amount of coastal routes that go up into the North Sea. Otherwise, Germany is a landlocked country, and Germany needed supplies to be able to survive this war. Well, the British are going to try and take those supplies from them by blockading all of their ports out into the North Sea, which caused massive hunger riots throughout most of Germany, and especially amongst their citizenry, right? For example, that right there is actually a butcher shop, as you can see, actually feine Fleische, which means actually fine meats, that has been attacked by German peasants and raided because so many people in German cities are running out of food due to this British blockade. Well, the German strategy that's adopted in retaliation to this is going to be a very important strategy in World War I known as unrestricted submarine warfare. When they're going to use those submarines that they developed during that Anglo-German arms race, right? When the Brits were building the dreadnoughts and the Germans start building their submarines, they're going to decide, all right, we're going to take our Unterseebooten and we're going to use it and we're going to sink anything that comes across our path. Anything at all, right? If it shows up, if it's a fishing boat, it's done. If it's a maritime vessel, it's done. If it's a merchant ship, it's done. If it's a cruise boat, it's done. If it's Abby Hebler in a canoe, it's done. It doesn't matter, right? And so they're going to use those submarines to attack at full force, right? And they're going to sink any vessel. And it's actually extremely effective, mostly because these U-boats were so advanced for their time, right? And nobody could see them coming. Now, the thing about it, though, is it's going to get Germany into a big thing of hot water, though, when they accidentally sink, but not accidentally whatsoever. One of their submarines actually sinks a cruise liner, right? And it sinks this bad boy known as the Lusitania, right? And the Lusitania was a cruise ship that had over 1,800 people on it, right? And the thing about it, though, is what's going to happen is that happens in 1915, right? Early on in this war, and 1,200 civilians are going to end up dying. But wait, there's more. 128 of those 1,200 were Americans, right? And how do you think that the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, by the way, is who I'm referring to right there as Wilson, Woodrow Wilson is going to respond to this, where he's going to call for Germany to cease these unrestricted warfare tactics, right? He's like, no sinking cruise boats and stuff like that anymore, Germany, lest you want America involved in this war, right? And so Germany actually backed off of it for a little while, right? They backed off of unrestricted submarine warfare for a little bit of time, until they resume it in about 1917, actually, because of this thing called the Zimmerman Note. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. But at this point, by World War I's midway point, about 1915, fighting is beginning to break out everywhere. It's breaking out in African colonies that have actually fallen subject to imperialism. It's breaking out in the Middle East now as well, because the Brits, to try and destroy the Ottoman Empire, are actually encouraging Arab revolts inside of the Ottoman Empire in areas like Syria and modern-day northern Jordan, right? And they're actually being led by this guy right here that some people actually in the house might know of if you're listening to this whole thing, adults in the house, right? A guy named Sir Lawrence of Arabia, right? Sir Lawrence of Arabia was a British soldier that actually was sent to the Middle East to encourage these revolts to try and destabilize the Ottoman Empire from within, right? Now, the Ottomans are going to have a massive response to this, and they're going to have a terrible military campaign, right? The Ottomans do not do a very good job in this war whatsoever, and they actually end up blaming a large group of people known as the Armenians, right? And the Armenians are actually going to have perpetrated on them by the Ottomans a genocide, right? The Armenians were accused by the Ottoman Empire of actually helping the Russians and the Allies win the war itself. And what they do in response to that is they strip and steal Armenian land from over 800,000 Armenians, and several 100,000 people end up dead because of this, because they were forced to go on massive death marches throughout the Syrian desert, right? And so as you can see, this is breaking out everywhere. And by the way, most of the time that we've been talking about this, we've been talking about the Western Front, right? But the Western Front is out in France, right? Between mostly Germany and France, okay? The Eastern Front, on the other hand, was between the Austrians, the Germans, and the Russians, right? Now, in the back of your mind, you're thinking to yourself, pah, The Russians are doing fine. They're huge and they have a massive military, right? No, they're not. The Russians are getting absolutely wrecked, right, in World War I, okay? By the time we got this point going down in about 1915, 1916, going into 1917, right, as this war is beginning to get worse and worse, the Russians, as you can see, are losing ground effectively, right? This right here is the furthest the Russians ever advanced in 1914, and it's just getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of different things, but also trench warfare wasn't heavily prevalent in the Eastern Front, right? Because the ground was so cold, and it also was unable to build over such a vast territory, right? But the thing about it, though, is that you got to ask yourself, though, is why is Russia doing so bad in this war, right? Why are they losing so harshly? Well, a lot of it has a lot to do with problems that existed in Russia before the war ever even started, right? World War I exacerbated a lot of long-term problems that existed within Russia up until that point. For example, incomplete industrialization. Y'all, we talked about this multiple times, right? For example, Peter the Great's going to do his best to try and westernize Russia, right? He does his best, right? And then later leaders try to do their best as well to keep up with the Industrial Revolution that was going on emanating out of Great Britain. And that guy was named Alexander II. But remember, that guy got blown up, right? And Alexander III doesn't push it as hard. And so the industrialization ends up pretty incomplete, right? And then on top of everything else, there's a massive amount of political unrest, right? There's a huge amount of political unrest and a huge amount of actual protests going on throughout Russia because of the things that are going on in the late 1800s, right? In response to imperialism, Russia and Japan end up getting into a war over an area in China. There's a northern area in China called Manchuria that is resource dense, and the Russians wanted it so they could connect their Trans-Siberian Railway to it, right? Well, the Japanese wanted it following their Meiji Restoration and their modernization, and they end up going to war over it, right? And ironically enough, Russia ends up losing this war and gets embarrassed in this war, which leads to a small revolution that happened in 1905, where a bunch of people showed up in a large square outside of the St. Petersburg Winter Palace and then all got shot, right? And that was known as the Bloody Sunday movement, right? And Bloody Sunday, after all these people got shot in a nonviolent protest, Nicholas II and the Tsardom at the time decided to give up some things. And they were like, okay, fine, we'll get a legislative branch like y'all are begging for. And they called their new legislative branch the Duma, right? But the thing about it was that this failed revolution of 1905 actually gave the absolutist a supreme veto, and he could override and veto anything he wanted that came out of the Duma. So that revolution was ultimately considered a failure, right? And then you also have another problem as well, political stagnation, right? Basically, the politicians that are at play in Russia by this point are inadequate and terrible leaders. And they're these people right here. You've got the Tsar at the time, Nicholas II, who will be the last Tsar of Russia. You got his wife, Tsarina Alexandria, right? Who's actually not even Russian. She's German, funny enough. And so a lot of people hated her guts about that going into World War I because she could barely speak Russian and she actually was German by descent. They're like, why do we have this German princess on our throne during this war? This is ridiculous. And then you have her wizard, none other than Grigory Rasputin, right? Who serves as a legal counsel and also a mystic advisor to the royal family. Let me say that again. You've got two rulers of Russia who have a wizard that helps advise them in this whole thing. Sounds not that stable, but we'll talk a little bit more about Rasputin in class and stuff like that and talk about how he ends up dead after a lot of attempts, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, you also have mass desertions of the military. In World War I, Russia was seeing huge amounts of soldiers desert the military in perpetuity. They were just leaving left and right and refusing to go back and fight because they were losing so bad and they were getting beat by the Germans. And then they were also having their family members send them letters being like, we're running out of food. We have nothing to do. We don't know what was going on. And so they're having huge desertions of the military. Well, what this ended up leading to is Russia hit a breaking point, right? And in 1917, they go through a successful revolution. And now this is phase one of the communist revolution that would forever change Russia from Russia into the USSR, right? That some of y'all have definitely heard of before. The USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, right? Where they would rise out of the ashes of Russia and become a communist state and then literally become the power that would dictate the progression forward of many different European affairs from 1918 up until its eventual collapse in the 1990s, right? Now, the February Revolution, is phase one, right? And phase one is when the whole bunch of people showed up when Nicholas II was at the front, right? So Nicholas II was an idiot, right? Like, he's not a really, really good leader at all, right? And he is, of course, the Romanov father to the famous Princess Anastasia, right? Father also to Alexei, the little boy with hemophilia. We'll talk about that a little bit more in class because it's never going to be on an AP test. But he decided to actually, oh, I can help out the Russian war effort. I'll just go to the front and help lead them from there. What an idiot, right? And so he goes up there, and what that actually happened is, when the cat's away, the mice will play. And the people of Russia knew that he was gone, right? And so on International Women's Day, mass demonstrations, marches, and strikes broke out all over the streets of Petrograd. Now, don't get too confused. Petrograd is the name that they had changed St. Petersburg to, okay? In World War I, they changed the name of St. Petersburg to Petrograd because they thought St. Petersburg sounded too German, right? And so they were like, instead of St. Petersburg, we're going to call it Petrograd, which sounds super Russian, right? And so this kind of shows you that animosity that they had towards the queen, right? The Tsarina Alexandria, right? But yes, like on International Women's Day, riots, strikes, and intense protests broke out all over the streets, demanding bread, demanding land redistribution, and demanding an end to the war as well, right? Well, when told to fire on the crowds by Nicholas, because Nicholas received a telegraph that there were street riots breaking out, he said to do the same thing that happened on Bloody Sunday. Oh, well, shoot them, right? Well, when told to fire on the crowds, the military refused, and they actually instead joined them, right? And so in fear of this, what Nicholas II is going to do is before he even comes back to St. Petersburg, he abdicates the throne. In March of 1917, street riots and protests in a military that refused to follow orders led to the last Tsar of Russia retiring his throne, right? And the second he got back to Petrograd, he actually gets arrested, and the family would be detained for the remainder of the war. And by detained, I mean held prisoner, right? The original plan was to send them to England with their cousins and stuff like that, but that never actually happened, and they stuck them out in Siberia, actually, instead, in a prison detainment, right? Well, what's going to happen now? What happens? There's a power vacuum has now been created because we have no king and no czar to lead over the state of Russia. Well, they're going to try to stick a government together, right? Well, because they tried to offer it to this other guy that was one of his, like, relatives, I think it's his nephew or something like that, and he refused to take the throne because he's like, I'm not doing that, not when the military refuses to even do what I tell him to. And so what's going to happen is you got two new groups that pop up, right? One is known as the provisional government. Now, let's break that word down really quick. Provisional government. It's meant to be temporary, y'all. It's meant to be temporary. Provisional means for the time being or for now, right? Well, the provisional government was that thing called the Duma, the thing that came out of the failed 1905 revolution. And the Duma basically created this government that was a legislative body, right? Led by this guy named Alexander Kerensky, right? And the thing about it, though, is then another company or another government was started, right? I kid you not, when I say this, it's called the Petrograd Soviet, right? The thing about this, y'all, no one in the government, no one in this one started this. All right, so yeah, the Petrograd Soviet was a shadow government that started in the background, that literally created itself out of workers and soldiers to be like, we're going to dismantle the Russian government from within inside. They're not even going to know who the heck we are, right? And so literally a shadow government was started known as the Petrograd Soviet, right? Now, what ends up going down, though, is a feud between these two governments begins, right? Because the provisional government, which was trying to get Russia to move along in the war, has this other group of people that are sabotaging them, and they don't even know who they are, right? And so the thing about it that ends up happening is the provisional government made a terrible choice, right? The Russians, when they did the March Revolution, were calling for one thing, an end to World War I. They were like, we don't want to be in this war anymore. We don't care how much land we lose. We don't care. Please make it stop. Make it go away. Our guys need to come home, etc., etc., etc. Well, they still chose to stay in the war, right? Angering a lot of workers and a lot of soldiers, right? And these angry groups that they pissed off were called Soviets, right? Because a council of workers and soldiers in Russian are referred to as a Soviet. See, that's where the Petrograd Soviet came from, right? It was a council of workers and soldiers that were mad and angry at the provisional government for choosing to stay in World War I, and they formed themselves into that shadow government known as the Petrograd Soviet. And now the Petrograd Soviet tries to dismantle and weaken the provisional government from within itself, right? Doing it secretly and passing orders that no one told them to, right? So one of the first and most famous ones to try and undermine the provisional government, which is what that stands for, is this thing called Army Order Number 1, right? Which is, for example, okay, like to use this as an example, Army Order Number 1 was basically telling all of the soldiers that were fighting in World War I still that if your officer tells you to do something, you don't have to listen, right? If you want to desert, go and desert. If you want to do whatever you want to do, go and do whatever you want to do, because you didn't elect that man. You didn't choose that man to be your officer. He was chosen for you because of his birthright and his bourgeois status, right? So does a lot of this stink and smell of socialism and communism? Well, it should, because they are getting their biggest superhero, right? This guy enters into Russia right when the provisional government starts, right when the February Revolution, which happened in March, by the way. There's a whole thing with the Russian calendar. I'll explain it in class. Don't worry about it. But enter this man, Vladimir Lenin, right? Vladimir Lenin shows up, right? And he takes hold of the Petrograd Soviet. And he takes hold of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, right? And he shows up from exile, right? Like he was literally in exile in Switzerland because the Russians hated him that much, right? He actually was a very, very, very astute communist, a very intense communist who loved Marxist theory, but he thought it needed to be changed a little bit and augmented for the modern era, right? You need to know that, right? He wanted to take Marxist ideas and apply it to the modern era, right? And so the thing about it is when I say enter Vladimir Lenin, I mean that quite literally. My guy showed up, right? And guess who got him there? The Germans did. The Germans purposefully smuggled this man back into Russia to destabilize their government because they knew he had a following and they knew that he would further destabilize the government to the point where they would actually pull them out of the war and Germany would be able to take all their forces and focus them on the Western Front, right? Enter Vladimir Lenin, who takes control of the Petrograd Soviet to try and destabilize the provisional government, along with his assistants. He has two assistants that are very famously by his side. A man by the name of Leon Trotsky, who is this guy that will lead the provisional government directly, and his other guy that leads the citizen army, known as Joseph Stalin, right? And for those of you who got a little chill up your back just now because of the name Joseph Stalin, you should have, right? So because he becomes the dictator of Russia during World War II. This is what he looked like when he was younger, too. By the way, a lot of people thought he was like really, really good looking when he was a younger man. The thing about it, though, okay, going into it, his assistants, Leon Trotsky, show up, and Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Lenin, and they decide that they would use their followers, known as the Bolsheviks, to destabilize the provisional government and try to take hold completely of the Russian government and send them into a communist state, right? Because the Bolsheviks are heavily communist and they favor violence, right? And when we call them Bolsheviks, where the word comes from, it means majority, right? So like inside of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, which was the Communist Party of Russia, right? They just called themselves the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, but they were truly communist at their core. The majority of them that favor communism and violence are called Bolshevik, because Bolshevik means the majority, right? And the minority of them that favored elections and liberal ideas and trying to be chill and soft about this called the Mensheviks, right? Because they're the minority of the groups, right? But we'll talk about them a little bit more, right, in class, and we'll get into this big thing that blows up in everybody's face, known as the October Revolution, when Vladimir Lenin says we have had enough, and he gave these massive speeches where he preached peace, land, and bread, which appealed to the masses, calling an end for the war, and more land distribution, and food for the hungry. And he galvanized a small citizen army. They're going to overthrow that provisional government. And they're not going to do it chill. They're going to do it by force. But I'll see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.